My name is Kiara Benson. I'm 29 years old, a senior graphic designer at a mid-sized agency in Boston. I design everything from packaging for eco skincare brands to full-blown campaign visuals for tech startups. I love what I do. I love the freedom it gives me to build, to create, to make things better. But if you asked me what I wanted more than anything in this world, I would have said, to belong. Not to a workplace. Not to a career. To my family. And that's exactly where everything fell apart. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd get blindsided by her own flesh and blood. But here I am, almost 30, sitting across the kitchen table from my older brother Gregory Benson, who just shoved a legal document across to me and told me to sign it. No preamble. No explanation. Sign this, now. Just like that. Like I owed him something. Like all the years I spent trying to prove myself, to stay connected, to show up for birthdays and hospital visits and awkward family dinners didn't count. It wasn't even the tone he used that got me. It was the assumption. The arrogance. The way his fingers drummed impatiently on the table as if he were doing me a favor. But before I get ahead of myself, let me take you back. Because things like this, familial betrayals, backroom decisions, broken hearts, they don't happen overnight. No one wakes up and says, "Today, I'm going to be the forgotten child." That title is handed to you, slowly, quietly. Until one day you realize it's all you've ever been. I grew up in the small town of Amherst, Massachusetts. Our house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac with cracked sidewalks and a swing set that groaned every time the wind blew. It wasn't glamorous, but it was home. My parents, Helen and Richard Benson, were classic New England stock, hardworking, no nonsense, never ones for big displays of affection, but always there with dinner on the table and clean clothes in the drawer. Dad worked as a property manager and spent most of his weekends fixing other people's broken toilets or patching roofs. Mom was a school administrator. She ran the local middle school like a ship captain during a storm firm, composed, quietly exhausted. Then there was Greg, 3 years older than me. Captain of the football team in high school, voted most likely to run the world in his senior yearbook. And honestly, for a long time, I thought he would. Greg had that kind of charm that made adults overlook the smirks and the rule-breaking. He knew how to say just enough of the right thing to win you over and never a word more. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one, the kid with paint on her fingers and sketchbooks stuffed in her backpack. I wasn't loud, I wasn't flashy, but I was steady, consistent. I did everything by the book. And somehow, that made me invisible. I remember one Christmas, I must have been about 12. I spent weeks hand-making gifts for everyone. Little portraits sketched in pencil, framed with ribbon. Greg gave Mom and Dad matching mugs he bought last minute from the gas station. Guess whose gift got put on the mantle? His did. Mine got buried in a drawer. I told myself it didn't matter. That the joy was in the giving. That maybe they were just tired. But even then, I think part of me knew the truth. Greg had always been their favorite. And it wasn't just favoritism, it was trust. When Dad had his first heart scare, it was Greg they called from the hospital. When Mom needed help with the finances, Greg got the passwords and the keys to the lockbox. I got updates after the fact. Text messages that started with, "Don't worry, everything's under control." Everything was always under Greg's control. After college, I moved to Boston and started my career from scratch. No connections, no favors, just a decent portfolio and the will to prove I belonged somewhere. And it worked. Slowly, painfully, I carved out a place for myself in the world. Promotions, praise, stability. I even bought myself a tiny condo with a balcony just big enough for 2 chairs and a pot of basil. Still, I kept coming home. Thanksgiving, Mother's Day, random weekends. I helped fix the back deck. I made dinner when Mom's arthritis flared up. I filed Dad's insurance claims when his eyesight got bad. I did it all not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because I loved them. And I thought, maybe, if I just kept showing up, eventually I'd stop feeling like the outsider. But that moment never came. Instead, what came was Gregan, a rainy Tuesday in March, dropping a folder on the kitchen table with a legal contract tucked inside, and that single, cold command. Sign this. Now. Naughty play. I looked at the pages. It was about the house. The one I'd grown up in. The one I'd painted when I was 16, mowed the lawn of every summer, cried in when I didn't get into my dream college. The house I still considered a part of me. And it wasn't mine anymore. Not unless I did what Greg said. I sat there, heart pounding against my ribs like a warning drum, as the rain tapped a steady rhythm on the kitchen window behind Greg. I hadn't eaten, my coffee was cold, swirled with letters I still couldn't bring myself to read. The contract lay between us, a chasm wider than any words could span. My chest tightened as I confronted the fact that my brotherly blood was trying to strip me of what mattered most, our home. You know what this is, Greg said, his eyes cold and level. He folded his arms, leaning back as if the world had already tilted in his favor. It's either sign or we renegotiate. But renegotiate means lawyers, court, time, family drama. Don't do that to Mom and Dad. The name of our parents bubbled in my throat, and pain sharpened in my chest. He was being cruel with purpose. So you want to force me into something while keeping everything convenient for you? You're exaggerating, he said, voice smooth, dismissive. It's business. Family business. I corrected softly, but with everything cracking beneath me. This isn't the quarterly report. This isn't some startup financial. This is my childhood home, the place I stopped because I felt tears prick my eyelids. I swallowed them down before they could embarrass me further. I know you didn't write this, so who did? I pressed, leaning forward, voice low but urgent. He didn't answer. Instead, he stared at me like I was an inconvenience he forgot to schedule a meeting for. That's when the reality hit me in full force. I had no say. This wasn't a conversation. It was a final notice. I slid the contract aside, my hands trembling. Give me a break, Greg. I'm not ready to make a decision. Behind my words, a storm raged, a mixture of anger, betrayal, heartbreak, and a desperation that clawed its way up my throat. I could feel it in every cell. I could taste it in the air. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in years, and narrowed his eyes. Then he reached into the folder and pulled out another document. Then sign this, he said, handing it to me. It's a waiver confirming you won't contest anything. It's non-negotiable. My breath hitched at the words, non-negotiable. I slid it back with more force than I intended. No, I said. Simple, clean, and utterly terrifying. Greg's smile was thin, cruel in its precision. Then we do this the hard way. You know who's already on board to make sure Mom and Dad's wishes are honored. That had to be Mom's lawyer. I felt a flash of grief knowing she was protecting a plan I wasn't part of, hadn't been told about. Why wouldn't they tell me? I felt dizzy with anger and confusion and grief. No explanation flashed in my mind more sharply than the memory of Mom's last birthday. The cake candlelight reflecting in her eyes. He'd asked me to her kitchen for a surprise, and then pulled me in for a hug I'd almost thought was real. But now the hug felt like a setup. You're cheating me out of what's mine, I whispered, more hurt than rage. And you're doing it deliberately. He leaned across the table so close I could count the whiskers on his jaw. You've got a great job in Boston. You don't need the house. You said it yourself, it's just nostalgia. And just like that, the betrayal cut deeper. He had rehearsed, framed my life, my choices, as excuses to discard me. I saw through it but also felt the crumbling of my own resolve. A long silence stretched. As thunder rolled outside, I realized words were useless right now. My heart felt like it was bleeding in slow motion. I glanced at my phone, a barrage of unopened texts from my mom and dad, probably frantic. I didn't want to read them yet. I didn't want to break. Give me time, I murmured, voice trembling. Time's already gone. Greg replied, gathering his folders like a predator. Think about it. I leave Thursday. If I don't have it signed by then, we move forward without you. He stood, dropped the folders into his bag, and paused. I'm doing this to protect the family. You'll thank me later. That line protected the family twisted like a knife. I wanted to laugh in his face. Because nothing about this felt protected. It felt like theft and abandonment. And the final proof that I'd never been more than a placeholder in their eyes. He closed the fridge door with his elbow and walked out, leaving the smell of takeout still clinging to the countertops. When the door clicked shut, I leaned into the kitchen island, breathing fast and shallow. The rain sounded louder now, a drumbeat of this moment's gravity. I wanted to scream. I wanted to burn the contract right there. I wanted my mother to sweep in and tell me it wasn't true. But no one did. It was just me, alone. Inside those 4 pastel walls that felt like a cage. Later, I stood at the window, my silhouette against the rain, watching Greg's car disappear down the drive. I pictured the empty house behind him. Their empty smiles, their polite avoidance. The lawyer's signature waiting in the envelope, significance swallowing me whole. When I finally sat down to call my mom, my voice cracked like glass. She answered, strained familiarity dancing in her tone. Hey, sweetie, are you home? I closed my eyes. Mom, I said, squeezing tears behind my lids. I need answers. I don't know what's happening. She hesitated, and I could feel it on the line. Then she whispered, he's just trying to help. I cut in, voice shaking. He's trying to sign me out of the house. He said I have no say unless I sign. Pain burned in my chest. Why didn't you or Dad tell me about this? Darling, she said softly, but gentle words can harden faster than steel. We thought Greg is better equipped to handle these things. It wasn't personal. It wasn't personal. Her words reverberated in me. It wasn't personal. She meant well. She said it out of love. The words meant nothing when what they carried crushed me. I sank to the kitchen floor, my back pressed against pale yellow cabinets. The house, once my refuge, felt distant, shrinking away like an illusion. That night, I lay awake in my Boston apartment, the city's lights drifting through the windows. I couldn't sleep, not with the weight of this snow, not just this betrayal. Not just the contract, but every memory suddenly stained. My brother's birthday surprise that I planned and he forgot. The card I left on the mantel that got thrown away. The times I sat alone at home when I was sure they'd miss me, but they didn't. I pulled out my laptop and opened the email chain with my dad's lawyer, CC'd. I reread old wills and drafts about Mom and Dad's estate. It mentioned a figure tagged to Manat the house, just a sum. A footnote. Not what they talked about. Not what I helped keep afloat. They had hedged their bets, assigned me a secondary place. Because they didn't trust me with the heart of what really mattered. In the early hours of the morning, I fell asleep with tears still on my cheeks, exhaustion and anger battling for supremacy. When I woke, determination had replaced despair. I realized I couldn't wait. I couldn't beg. The stakes were bigger than nostalgia. This was about dignity, about fairness. About proving that being family means something not just on holidays, not just when nurses are late, but on rainy Tuesdays with legal papers dumped on kitchen tables. The next day, I scheduled a consultation with a family attorney in Boston. I messaged my closest friend, Ava Matthews, who's been a rock since college. I started compiling every text, email, card, moment of support I'd given my family, proof I hadn't taken the house for granted, proof I was invested. Because if I was going to go up against Greg and whatever shadow figure behind this plan, I wasn't going in blind. And yet, despite the planning, a knot of fear lurked under it all. What if I lose? What if this ruins everything? What if by the time I'm done, I'm not even fighting to keep the house but for permission to be part of the family at all? I slid the waiver back into the drawer and locked it. I was done hiding. It was my move now. Because some moments change you forever. This was one of them. Mr. Benson House wasn't just brick and wood. It was my history, every scraped knee, every midnight tear, every painting session, every apology forgiven. And if my brother thought he could dismiss me like I'd never mattered, well, he hadn't counted on me flipping the script. The battle lines were drawn. And I was ready. I don't think there's a word strong enough for the way it feels when you start to realize you're the family's afterthought. Not the enemy. Not even the scapegoat. Just the one they don't think about. The one they leave off the group text, forget to call, forget to include until they need something signed. It's a quiet kind of pain. A slow-growing ache that starts as a whisper and settles deep into your bones. It doesn't scream, it hums, low and constant, until it colors everything you remember. After the confrontation with Greg, I started seeing things differently. Moments that used to feel like coincidences, like innocent oversights, suddenly took on a sharper edge, like they'd always known, always chosen, always decided without me. I remembered the time they remodeled the house, my childhood home, and I wasn't even told until the kitchen was already gutted. Greg had picked out the new countertops. My mom had emailed him pictures. I found out on Facebook, from a photo Greg posted with the caption, "New look, new memories." I'd stared at the screen, heart sinking, wondering why no one thought to ask if I wanted to be part of it. I was living 2 hours away. It wouldn't have taken much. A phone call, a single question. But I wasn't considered. Again. Or that Thanksgiving 2 years ago and I showed up with pumpkin pie and cranberry sauce I'd made from scratch only to find that dinner had started without me. Greg's wife, Natalie, smiled a little too brightly when I walked in late, as if she was surprised I still came to these things. I sat at the end of the table, the spot closest to the kitchen door, and tried to catch up on conversations I wasn't part of. No one asked me about work. No one commented on the food. When I finally spoke something about a new brand campaign I was excited about, Greg cleared his throat and redirected the conversation to his latest property flip. The room leaned toward him like sunflowers bending toward light. I was tired of talking to the backs of people's heads. But the worst part wasn't the exclusion, it was that I kept forgiving it. I kept making excuses. They're busy. They didn't mean it. Greg just dominates the room, he's not doing it on purpose. Mom's stressed. Dad's just old-fashioned. I told myself I was being too sensitive. That I had no right to complain when they still invited me, still kept the door open. I convinced myself I didn't need attention to be part of the family. But then Greg dropped that contract on the table, and suddenly, all the tiny slights lined up like soldiers on a battlefield, revealing the truth I'd refused to see. This wasn't just neglect. This was intentional. They had carved out a future without me, and no one had the decency to say it aloud. After that meeting, I stopped texting first. I waited. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2. No one called. Not even Mom. I stared at my phone every night, waiting for it to light up with her name. It didn't. So I sent a text. "Hey, Mom, can we talk about what Greg brought to the house? I just need to understand what's going on." No reply. I waited 3 more days before she finally wrote back. "Sweetheart, we don't want this to become a big thing. Greg is just helping us make some decisions. We thought it was better that way." Better. That word gutted me. Better for who? I called her. She didn't answer. I called again the next night. Still nothing. So I sent another text. "Why didn't anyone talk to me before making this decision? Do you even care how this feels?" She replied 3 hours later. "It's not personal, Kiara. It's just what makes the most sense right now." That sentence destroyed something in me. Not personal. That was the Benson family motto, wasn't it? Keep things practical. Keep things smooth. Don't confront. Don't acknowledge hurt. Just keep moving forward, and if someone falls behind, well, they should have kept up. I started pulling away, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. I couldn't keep chasing people who treated me like a guest in my own story. I stopped checking the family group chat. I ignored Greg's birthday, even though I had remembered. I didn't drive down for my dad's blood pressure check, even though I had always been the one to coordinate his meds and follow-up calls. No one said anything. I realized they didn't notice my absence. One night, I sat alone on my balcony in Boston, wrapped in a thick blanket, staring out at the skyline. I just finished a long project tone of my proudest yet, and when the client had praised my work in a glowing email, the first person I wanted to tell was my mother. My finger hovered over her contact name. But I couldn't do it. Because I knew that even if she answered, she wouldn't really hear me. I missed her. I missed my dad's dry humor. I even missed Greg before he became whatever this version of him was. Before he started treating me like an obstacle. But I missed a version of them that maybe never really existed. Maybe I had built those people in my head. Maybe the reality had always been colder. I cried that night. Not out of rage but out of mourning. I mourned the family I thought I had, the connection I thought was real. I mourned the space at the table I kept trying to earn, not realizing they'd already pulled my chair away. But even through the sadness, something shifted inside me. A line. A quiet, powerful line I drew in my soul. I would not beg for love anymore. I would not fight to be tolerated. If they didn't see my worth, I would. And if Greg wanted a war, he'd get one. Because I may not have had the last name advantage or the golden child status or the legal support he did, but I had something better. I had truth. I had receipts. And I had the fire of every silent moment they forced me to swallow, burning bright in my chest. They thought I would break. But I was just getting started. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely announces itself. It doesn't come storming in with sirens and flashing lights. It sneaks in quietly like a draft through a cracked window, chilling your bones long before you realize the door's been opened to something cruel. And once you notice it, it's too late. It's already inside. After Greg handed me that contract after I refused to sign it, was like someone flipped a switch in my family. The silences grew louder, the conversations grew shorter. Every time I called, I got voicemails. Every time I texted, I got half-hearted responses with periods that felt colder than they should have. I wasn't just being ignored, I was being shut out. And then the paperwork started showing up. It began with a letter from a lawyer I didn't know, one whose name wasn't even listed in my parents' previous will documents. The letter was clinical, worded like a transaction, not a message to a daughter. It referred to me as Miss Kiera Benson, beneficiary in question, and outlined that, due to recent restructuring of the family estate, your standing as an heir has been revised to reflect changes agreed upon by the majority stakeholders. Majority stakeholders. That was the language they used for people, for flesh and blood. For me. I read that line over and over until it blurred. I held the paper in my shaking hands, sitting on the floor of my apartment, and the weight of those words made it feel like the world was tilting. I was a beneficiary in question. Not a daughter. Not someone who had shared holidays, cleaned up after Dad's surgery, paid for repairs on the downstairs water heater when Greg was too busy. Not someone who had stood by them when Mom's sister died and no one else showed up to organize the funeral. Just a stakeholder. A line item. I didn't cry then. I was too numb. But the bleeding didn't stop there. 2 days after the letter, I got a message from Natalie, Greg's wife. We hadn't spoken in months. Her text said, simply, "Hi Kiara, just a heads up, we'll be having the roof redone at the house this week. If you need anything from your old room, best to get it before Saturday." Greg said the contractor might be using it for storage. Just like that. My childhood bedroom where I'd sketched my first designs, written letters to my first crush, cried after my first heartbreak, reduced to storage space. No call. No. Do you mind? Just a heads up. Like I was a tenant overstaying her lease. I drove down that Friday afternoon, hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. I didn't call ahead. I didn't warn them. I just pulled into the driveway of the home I thought would always be safe, and for the first time in my life, I hesitated before opening the front door. Greg was there. He was talking to a contractor outside, clipboard in hand, like he owned the place. When he saw me, his expression didn't flicker. He didn't look surprised, just mildly annoyed. "You could have called," he said flatly. "I don't have to," I replied, my voice tight, controlled. "It's still my house, remember?" He didn't answer. Just motioned toward the door. "Make it quick." I walked past him without another word, every step heavier than the last. The house smelled different, like paint and plaster, like something being erased and rebuilt all at once. My room was barely recognizable. The bed was pushed into a corner, boxes stacked where my dresser used to be. Some of my things were still there, books, journals, a few drawings and a cracked portfolio. They were scattered, neglected, as if I'd left them years ago and no one cared enough to put them away properly. I stood in the center of that room, and for a moment, I didn't move. I just let it hit me that this wasn't a home anymore. It was a construction site, a project. Something Greg could flip and profit from, sentiment be damned. As I gathered my things, I found a photo, an old one. Me and Greg, side by side at the beach, maybe ages 10 and 13. We were smiling, windswept, sunburnt. A real smile, not the forced ones we'd learned to wear at family functions. I stared at that photo longer than anything else, wondering how we'd gone from that to this. When I left the room, Greg was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, arms crossed. I laughed bitterly. "You already made it hard, Greg. You just didn't think I'd notice." "What do you want me to say? That you're right? That this is unfair?" "It doesn't matter. Mom and Dad signed off. They agree with this." "I never got a say," I shot back. "And you never even gave me the courtesy of pretending like I should." He didn't respond. His silence said everything. I walked out without looking back. Later that week, I tried calling Mom again. I was still holding out hope that maybe, just maybe, she would give me something. A sliver of understanding. A moment of honesty. She picked up on the third ring. "Hi, sweetheart." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Mom, please tell me you didn't know what they were doing to my room. That you didn't approve that letter. That you didn't just erase me like this." She sighed an old, tired sound. "Kiara, it's not erasure. It's logistics. We needed someone to take the lead, and Greg—" "No," I interrupted, tears threatening to choke me. "You needed both your kids, you needed honesty. And you didn't even give me the chance to be included." Silence. Then, "I'm sorry you feel that way." That sentence shattered me more than any legal document ever could. I'm sorry you feel that way. Not, I'm sorry we hurt you. Not, I'm sorry we left you out. Just that hollow, corporate condolence people give when they want to shut down the conversation without taking any responsibility. I hung up the phone. I didn't text her after that. I didn't call. Because in that moment, I knew I wasn't just excluded. I had been erased. And the worst part? They didn't even feel guilty. There's a moment after you hit rock bottom where silence becomes unbearable, and the only thing left to do is stand up. Even if your knees are shaking and your heart still feels like it's been splintered into pieces no one bothered to pick up. I didn't know exactly when I made the decision to stop waiting for their approval, but I do know it happened on a Tuesday morning. After waking from another restless night filled with dreams of conversations that never happened, Mom reaching for my hand, Dad telling me he was proud, Greg apologizing, but of course, in the daylight, everything was still hollow, still broken, still too quiet. So I got out of bed, made a cup of black coffee, and opened a blank document on my laptop. Not because I had anything particular to say, but because I had to start somewhere. I titled it simply, Evidence, not for court, not for vengeance, but for myself. For every moment I'd swallowed my pain and chosen silence. For every family dinner where I smiled through being ignored. For every call I made that went unanswered. I listed the times I showed up driving 2 hours on a work night to fix Dad's printer, redesigning the flyer for Mom's retirement celebration when the committee's version looked like it was made in word art, offering Greg advice when he launched his short-lived fitness appand. Not once did they thank me. Not once did they say, "Kiara, we couldn't have done it without you." It wasn't just about the house. It was never just about the house. It was about being invisible while giving everything I had, about being needed in private and erased in public. So I documented. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. I needed to see myself clearly, what I'd done, who I'd been, what I was worth. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't being dramatic. I had been there, consistently, lovingly, until the day they told me I didn't matter. But I did matter. I had to believe that. That same week, I started therapy. It wasn't something I advertised. It felt almost too intimate to share. But the truth is, it saved me. My therapist, Dr. Miles, was soft-spoken but sharp, and when I told her everything about the will, the contract, the quiet rejection that had followed me since childhood, she didn't ask me why I hadn't fought back sooner. She asked me why I still felt like I needed to earn love I had already given unconditionally. I sat with that question for days. In the meantime, I started reaching out to people who had seen me, heard me, loved me without conditions. Ava, my best friend, met me for coffee and let me ramble through a storm of tears and fury and second-guessing, and when I finished, she didn't try to fix it. She just reached across the table and said, "Kiara, you don't need to prove anything to people who are never looking in the first place." That sentence stayed with me like a heartbeat. With her encouragement, I contacted another attorney, a woman named Rachel. Younger than Greg's gray-haired bulldog of a lawyer, but precise and passionate. She read through everything: the contract Greg had dropped in front of me, the estate documents, the emails. She looked up at me after half an hour and said, "They tried to make this look fair on paper, but it's not. You have more leverage than you think." I blinked, unsure if I heard her right. "You mean I still have a claim?" "You have more than a claim," she said. "You have a case. If you want to fight this, we fight it." And something flickered inside me then. Not rage. Not even hope. Just the beginnings of resolve. I started building a timeline, organizing my records, documenting everything from the repairs I paid for to the weekends I spent caring for my parents when Greg was too swamped. I wrote a letter to Mom and Dad, not angry, not pleading, just honest. I didn't send it. I don't think it was meant for them. I think it was meant for me to read aloud and realize that I had always been enough. That I wasn't less simply because I didn't shout, because I didn't push my way into conversations, because I believed love should be quiet and steady. I began showing up differently, not to my family, but to myself. I turned down an extra freelance gig to rest. I started jogging in the mornings, not for weight, not for aesthetics, but for the rhythm, the feeling of momentum. I said no more often. I said yes when it mattered. And every time I did, I imagined my younger self watching and whispering, "Finally." Greg called once during that time. Left a message. Said something about revisiting terms, about avoiding escalation. I didn't call back. I forwarded the voicemail to Rachel. Because this wasn't about keeping peace anymore. It was about reclaiming my voice. I wasn't a guest in my own history. I was the one who built the damn staircase they were standing on. And I was done waiting for permission to climb it. They say when you finally find your voice, the first people to get angry are the ones who counted on your silence. That became painfully clear the moment I told Rachel, my lawyer, that I wanted to send a formal response to Greg's contract. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't some kind of announcement or social media revelation. It was a carefully worded, legally binding letter of intent to dispute the transfer of the house, citing inheritance concerns, breach of fiduciary duty, and something called constructive exclusion. In plain English, I was calling them out. I was no longer sitting quietly at the edge of the table. The letter went out on a Monday. By Wednesday, the phone calls started. The first came from Aunt Margaret, Mom's older sister, who hadn't spoken to me since last Easter when I'd asked why I wasn't informed about Dad's minor stroke until 3 weeks after it happened. Her voice was clipped, polite, and laced with condescension. "Kiara, sweetheart. I heard you're escalating things. You really think this is worth causing such tension in the family? Your mother's not sleeping. Greg is trying to keep everything afloat. Maybe there's a reason they handled it the way they did." I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the countertop as her words twisted themselves like vines around my ribs. "They handled it by cutting me out," I said slowly. "And not one person bothered to ask me how I felt, not even you." There was a pause, then a sigh. "We all have our roles, Kiara. Greg's always been the one to manage the big things. It's just how it is. It's just how it is." That sentence made my blood boil, not because she said it, but because it was the same thing I'd whispered to myself for years every time I was overlooked. Every time I was passed by for decisions, for respect, for love, and now it was being fed back to me like gospel. I'm not asking for special treatment, I said. I'm asking for fairness. Well, she replied curtly, fairness is often a matter of perspective. She hung up before I could respond. The next day, Natalie sent me a message longer than her last one. Kiara, I know things have gotten complicated. Greg feels like you're attacking him when all he's trying to do is honor what your parents asked. If this goes to court, it's going to be expensive, messy, and public. We really hope you'll reconsider. This isn't like you. That last part, that sting of, this isn't like you, felt like a scalpel. Because she was right. It wasn't like me. The old Kirathe one they counted on would have stayed quiet, would have accepted the crumbs and called it a meal. Would have let Greg wrap up the deed and called it a misunderstanding. But I wasn't her anymore. And I wasn't sorry about it. Still, the worst confrontation wasn't from extended relatives or passive-aggressive texts. It came from my father. I hadn't spoken to him directly in weeks. He'd been strangely absent, letting Greg and Mom do the dirty work. But then he called me. No warning. No message first. Just his name blinking on my screen. I stared at the phone for a long moment before answering. Hi, Dad. His voice was tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from work or age, but the kind of tired that comes from disappointment, which hurt more than I wanted to admit. What are you doing, Kiara? I was quiet for a beat, then replied, I'm protecting what's mine. He exhaled, long and slow. This isn't you. You're not someone Wowho takes things to lawyers. We're family. Exactly, I said, voice sharper than I meant. We're family. And family doesn't erase each other from their future. His tone hardened. We didn't erase you. Yes, you did. I whispered. You signed documents behind my back. You let Greg do everything while I was left completely in the dark. I was supposed to be your daughter, not an afterthought. There was silence. A long, painful stretch of silence. Then, finally, he said, Greg has always been the more responsible one. You know that. I felt the words hit like a slap. Not because they were new, but because they were confirmation of everything I feared. I wasn't just excluded, I was deemed unworthy of trust, of responsibility, of being seen as an equal. I see, I said quietly, pressing my hand to my chest like it would somehow stop the crack forming there. So that's what you all think of me. It's not about love, he said quickly. We love you. But not enough, I cut in. Not enough to include me. Not enough to respect me. Kiara. I hung up. I'd never hung up on my father before. Not in anger, not in sadness. But this time, it wasn't an accident. It was a boundary. Later that night, I cried not because I regretted standing up for myself, but because doing it hurt more than I expected. I had hoped deep down that someone, anyone, would say I was right. That I was justified. That they had made a mistake. But no one did. All I got were veiled threats and guilt trips, and the more I pushed for justice, the more isolated I became. Still, the worst thing they ever did to me wasn't disinheritance. It wasn't erasing my bedroom. It wasn't taking away the house. The worst thing they did was make me feel like I had to choose between self-respect and belonging. But I had already made my choice. I would rather stand alone in the truth than be embraced in a lie. And if that meant losing them entirely, then so be it. Because I was done asking to be seen. Now, they were going to see me whether they wanted to or not. There are moments in life when the world doesn't explode around you, doesn't burst into chaos or fire or screams, but instead collapses inward, quietly and slowly, like a building folding in on itself without warning. And you're standing at the center of it, still breathing, still upright, but surrounded by the dust of everything that used to hold you up. Choking on the realization that the silence left behind is not peace, it's grief. That's what it felt like, waking up one morning to find that not a single person in my family had spoken to me in over 10 days. 10 days since I sent my response through Rachel. 10 days since I made it clear that I was standing my ground. 10 days of silence, so deafening it pulsed in my ears, Not a word from my mother, not a text from my father, not even a cold legal rebuttal from Greg or Natalie. Just silence. Heavy, stifling, punishing. And it wasn't just silence from them, it was silence everywhere. The kind of emotional isolation that starts to make you question the very shape of your own memories. I found myself wondering if I had exaggerated the closeness I thought we once had, if the warm moments I'd clung to in childhood were real or imagined. Did Dad ever hold me the way he held Greg when he won football games? Did Mom ever praise me the way she bragged about Greg's investment projects at brunches? Or was I always a shadow in the corners of their love, watching and hoping that one day the spotlight might fall on me? I'd like to say I stayed strong, that I carried on, went to work, kept focused, kept functioning. But the truth is, I unraveled. Slowly, steadily, until I barely recognized the woman staring back at me in the mirror. I stopped eating properly. I started skipping meals, then entire days passed where all I had was coffee and whatever snack bar I found in my purse. My skin broke out, my eyes were permanently rimmed red, and I couldn't bring myself to open certain drawers in my apartment drawers filled with cards and letters and photos of family vacations that now felt like lies printed in glossy ink. I spent hours staring at my phone, not hoping they would call anymore, but frozen in some in-between state, afraid that if I put it down, I'd miss the one moment someone decided to apologize. But of course, no apology ever came. I stopped answering Ava's texts. I stopped going to my yoga class. I turned down client calls and eventually took time off work under the vague excuse of personal matters. I told myself I just needed time to think, but I wasn't thinking. I was drowning in thought, paralyzed by a carousel of memories and what-ifs and imagined conversations where things turned out differently. One night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling long past 3 a.m., and I whispered out loud, to no one, "What did I do that was so wrong?" And I cried. I cried harder than I had in years, the kind of crying that breaks through your chest and comes from somewhere deeper than sadness, somewhere dark and raw and terrifying, the kind of place you only find when you've been betrayed, not by strangers, but by the people who raised you. The people whose faces you see when you close your eyes and try to remember what love is supposed to look like. I couldn't tell if I was grieving the house or the people. I couldn't tell if I wanted revenge or just for someone to admit they'd hurt me. There were days when I wanted to burn it all down. I opened Greg's messages, hovered over the forward to press option in my email, stared at the idea of exposing the whole damn story online. And then there were nights when I was so exhausted, so soul-tired, that I thought about sending him a message that said, "You win, take the house, just leave me alone." I felt like a tree stripped of every leaf, bare and brittle, all my roots pulled from the earth that once held me, and I wondered if I'd ever grow back. And yet, somewhere in that unbearable stillness, something tiny began to whisper. It wasn't strength. Not yet. It was simply self. The small voice I had buried for years beneath obligation and politeness and silence. The voice that had asked, "Why not me?" every time Greg was praised. The voice that had whispered, "You deserve better," after every Thanksgiving dinner spent cleaning up alone in the kitchen while the rest of them laughed in the living room. The voice that, even now, broken and shaking and grieving, still believed I was worth hearing. And that voice, though faint, said something I hadn't let myself feel in weeks. You are allowed to hurt. You are allowed to be angry. You are allowed to feel betrayed. You are allowed to miss them and still not forgive them. You are allowed to stand up and still cry on the floor. You are allowed to not be okay. You are allowed to want more than what they gave you. That night, I didn't write anything or make plans or call anyone. I simply pulled the blanket over my shoulders, curled into myself, and whispered, "I am not wrong for wanting to be loved better, daughter." And it didn't fix anything. But it kept me alive. Sometimes, that's the first step. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It doesn't crash through the walls or shout its presence. It arrives quietly, slipped between papers, tucked into inboxes, hiding in the margins like it was always there, just waiting for you to be ready to see it. It was a rainy Thursday, 2 weeks after my longest, darkest stretch of silence. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor of my apartment, half-heartedly sorting through documents Rachel had asked me to gather anything related to the house, the estate, or my parents' financial dealings, when I came across an old manila envelope that had been stuffed in the back of my desk drawer. I barely remembered putting it there. The tab was unmarked, the edges worn and curling like it had been handled too often but with too little care. I opened it, expecting nothing, and found a handful of papers clipped together: tax documents, property assessments, and one odd page from what looked like an early draft of the estate plan. The header read, "Property allocation, preliminary, not final." And then I saw it, my name. Not as a footnote, not in the margin, not as a beneficiary in question. Aubrey. There, typed clearly and underlined in bold, were the words, Kiara Benson. 50% primary ownership, 342 Mason Lane, family home. I blinked. Reread it. Then again. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't vague. It wasn't legally binding yet, no, but it was proofwritten, time-stamped, documented proof that at one point, before Greg took over everything, before they started pushing me out, my parents had fully intended to leave the house to both of us. Equally. Half. Not nothing. Not storage space. Not, you don't need it anyway. Half. It was like cold water to the face. My fingers started trembling, and I felt a surge of something I hadn't let myself feel in weeks: validation. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining the erasure. I hadn't been left out because I didn't deserve it. I had been pushed out. Removed. Overridden. And for the first time, I saw Greg's strategy for what it was. Control. It wasn't just about the house. It was about power. About rewriting the narrative. About crafting a version of reality where he was the hero, the one holding the family together, the one making hard decisions, while I was framed as unstable, emotional, unpredictable, too artistic. Too sensitive, too distant. That document in my hands was more than a piece of paper. It was the crack in the story, the flaw in the foundation he'd built his lies on. I emailed a copy to Rachel immediately. She called me within the hour, her voice buzzing with energy I hadn't heard from her before. "This changes everything," she said. "If this is authenticated, and I have no reason to believe it won't be, it's evidence of intent, strong intent. It predates the final version they filed, and if we can show undue influence from Greg in getting it changed, we may have grounds not just for contesting the will, but for launching a formal dispute against him directly." Undue influence? I asked, my voice thick with disbelief. "Yes," she said firmly. "If Greg manipulated your parents, or if he used his access to isolate you from key decisions, or worse, coerced them into restructuring the plan to benefit himself, we can argue that he acted in bad faith. And that's not just unethical, it's legally actionable." I sat in stunned silence. Because somewhere, buried under all my heartbreak, a different fire began to burn. Anger, yes, but also clarity. Purpose. Resolve. He thought I was weak. He thought I'd fold. He thought I'd drown in grief, disappear into my feelings, and let him take everything. He thought he'd get away with rewriting history. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I called Ava that night, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't cry when I told her what was happening. I sounded different. Like someone who had finally stepped back into her own body after months of floating just above the pain. "I'm going to fight him," I said. "Not out of spite, not because I want revenge, but because I deserve to be heard." She was quiet for a moment, then said gently, "You always did." The next few days were a blur of preparation. Rachel helped me draft a motion to formally contest the updated will. We pulled emails, timestamps, and tracked the timeline of when the estate plan shifted from including me to excluding me. Rachel even hired a handwriting analyst to review signatures, just in case we needed to challenge authenticity. We didn't leave anything to chance. And then, I made the hardest decision of all. I emailed my mother. Not to ask. Not to beg. But to warn. "Hi, Mom. I wanted to let you know that I found documentation showing I was meant to inherit half the house. I've also hired legal representation. This will be handled through the appropriate channels. I don't want this to get uglier than it already has. But I will not disappear quietly. Kiara. She didn't reply. Not for 2 days. And when she finally did, it wasn't long, it wasn't warm, it wasn't even apologetic. It simply said, "I wish it hadn't come to this. But I understand. Take care of yourself." I read it 5 times, waiting to feel something: rage, relief, sadness, but what I felt was emptiness. A quiet, strange emptiness. Because the mother who could have picked up the phone and said, "We made a mistake," or even just, "I'm sorry," had chosen to remain silent behind polite detachment. She wished it hadn't come to this. But it had come to this. Because they brought it here. Greg thought I wouldn't fight back. But now I had the truth on my side. And I wasn't just going to hold it close like a secret. I was going to burn down every lie with it. It happened in the living room of the house. I almost lost the one with the dent in the coffee table from where Greg had dropped his football helmet in 9th grade. The same one where Mom and I once curled up under blankets to watch Little Women when I had the flu, where laughter once echoed without the weight of ownership, division, or betrayal pressing down on every brick. Now, it was the setting for the confrontation I never wanted but had no choice but to face. Greg sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on knees, phone in hand like a shield, the corners of his mouth twitching between smugness and irritation. Natalie hovered behind him, arms folded, face unreadable, and Mom stood off to the side, hands clasped. Lips pressed into a line so thin it looked like she was trying not to speak, because saying the wrong thing might shatter whatever illusion of family still remained. I came prepared. I had Rachel's preliminary findings printed, annotated, and highlighted. I had a copy of the original estate draft that named me as a 50% co-owner. I had a written record of Greg's initial contract and my rejection. But more than that, I had something no one could see, no one could hold in their hands. I had nothing left to lose. And that made me powerful. Greg barely looked up when I entered. "Is this really necessary?" he muttered, tossing his phone onto the coffee table. "You couldn't just call like a normal person?" I smiled, cold, steady. Normal people don't drop contracts on kitchen tables and demand signatures like threats. He leaned back. "So what now? You want to play lawyer? You want to make this a spectacle?" I stepped forward and set the documents on the table between us. "I want the truth, and I want it on record." "What truth?" His laugh was bitter, clipped. "The truth is that you were never around. You live in Boston, Kiara. You weren't here when they needed help with the roof. You weren't here when Dad was in and out of the ER. I was." My voice didn't rise, but it grew sharper. "Don't you dare question what I've done for this family. I was the one who filed Dad's insurance paperwork. I drove down every time Mom needed help during recovery. I helped keep this place running while you were too busy flipping properties and posting about investor mindset on LinkedIn." His mouth twisted. "So what? You want a medal for being a decent daughter?" "I want what was promised," I said. "And what was taken without consent." I reached into my folder and pulled out the page that changed everything. The one with my name, clear and deliberate, marked as co-owner. Greg's eyes flicked to it, then back to me. "That was a draft," he said quickly. "It wasn't finalized. But it was intentional," I countered. And then it changed. Abruptly. Without my knowledge, without discussion. And every legal document after that bears your input. Your attorney, your edits, your fingerprints. I turned to Mom. "Tell me I'm wrong." Her eyes darted between us, wide and glassy, like a child caught between two adults mid-argument. "Two didn't know it was going to be this bad. You knew it changed," I pressed gently. "You knew Greg took over everything. You knew I wasn't included, you just didn't say anything." I pulled. "I thought you didn't care about the house," she whispered, so soft I barely heard her. "You never said you wanted it." I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. "I didn't know I had to campaign for my inheritance, Mom. I thought being your daughter was enough." She flinched. Greg stood up suddenly. Okay, this is ridiculous. You think I manipulated them into changing their will? That's your angle now? You did more than manipulate, I said, stepping forward, heart pounding but steady. You isolated, you coerced. You buried documents. You assumed I'd roll over, because that's what I always did. You built your whole plan on the idea that I wouldn't fight back. He scoffed. This is exactly why we didn't involve you. You're too emotional. You take everything personally. I laughed once, quiet and cutting. Because it is personal, Greg. You didn't just steal a house, you tried to erase me. His jaw clenched. Natalie finally spoke. Greg, she has a point. He spun around. What? She looked between us, nervous, unsure, but her voice didn't waver. You never told me about that draft. And I was in the room for a lot of those meetings. You never mentioned her being included ever. His face darkened. Because it wasn't relevant. We moved on. To what? I asked. To a version of the truth that didn't include me? He didn't respond. I pulled out the final sheet, Rachel's legal intent to file for undue influence. I'm not bluffing, I said. This goes to court if it has to. And believe me, the minute it does, everyone sees what you tried to do. Greg stared at the document, and, for the first time, he looked unsure, not angry, not smug, but unsettled, as if something in him realized this wasn't going to end the way he planned. This is insane, he murmured. No, I said, voice clear and unshaking. What's insane is thinking you could cut your sister out of her own life story and get away with it. We stood there in silence and fuming, Mom looking like she wanted to vanish, Natalie shifting nervously, and me holding the truth like a torch I'd refused to let die. And for the first time, Greg looked small. Not because I'd beaten him, but because he finally realized I wasn't going to disappear. It didn't happen overnight. There was no single moment when Greg threw up his hands and admitted everything, no dramatic courtroom scene where a judge slammed the gavel and declared, "Justice has been served." Life isn't that tidy. But it did happen, and when it did, it didn't feel like a parade or a victory dance. It felt like breath, like air returning to lungs that had been strangled for too long, like standing still after a storm and realizing your feet are still planted, your heart still beating, and for the first time in what feels like forever, you're not afraid of being forgotten. It started with the lawyers. Rachel filed the notice of dispute, and the moment Greg was officially informed that I had legal standing, that I wasn't just making noise, but had leverage, evidence, and a capable attorney behind me, blinked. Not visibly, not in front of anyone, but in his emails, in the tone of his responses, in the quiet delay in every reply, you could feel it. The arrogance slipping, the bluster folding, the reality settling into his bones that I was no longer the little sister playing nice. I was a woman with a voice, with receipts, and with nothing left to lose. The family meetings stopped abruptly. The group chat went silent. Natalie texted me privately once, then not again, and Greg didn't reach out at all. A week later, Mom called. Not to yell, not to beg, not even to defend him. She sounded tired. Not the tired of someone who's run out of energy, but the tired of someone who's run out of excuses. I talked to the lawyer, she said. And? I asked, keeping my voice steady, not letting hope creep in. There's a lot we didn't know. About what Greg pushed. About what we signed. Your father, he just wanted it all to be over. I waited. We're withdrawing the current arrangement, she finally said. We're drafting a new will. One that reflects what your father and I originally agreed on. My breath caught, not in joy, not even in relief, but in disbelief. I sat there, frozen, afraid to speak, afraid that if I acknowledged the win, it might vanish. 50-50? She continued. You and Greg. Just like it was before. I swallowed hard, and after a long pause, I whispered, Why now? She didn't answer right away, then. Because I saw what you were willing to do, and I realized how much we let Greg dictate the story. I'm sorry, Kiara, I really am. It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't everything I needed. But it was enough to keep me breathing. A week later, Rachel and I sat in a mediation office across from Greg and his lawyer. He didn't look at me, not really. Just stared at the table, tapping a pen rhythmically, like he was trying to stay calm. When the mediator asked if we could resolve without litigation, I said yes. I didn't want revenge. I wanted recognition. I wanted the truth on paper. The agreement was simpler in statement of my equal inheritance, full transparency on the house's future, and a formal acknowledgement that I had been wrongfully excluded. No emotional clauses, no forced apologies. Just the facts, just the restoration of what was mine. Greg signed it. Reluctantly. Bitterly. But he signed. As we walked out of that room, I didn't speak to him. Not because I didn't have things to say, but because I'd said all I needed to with my silence, with my persistence, with the fact that I'd shown up, day after day. Even when the weight of being unwanted almost drowned me. And maybe he understood that. Because when we passed each other in the hall, he didn't smirk or scoff. He just nodded en passant, stiffened, looked away. The house was no longer a battleground. It became property again. Shared, named, co-owned. Mine in the way it always should have been. I went back there once, a few weeks after everything was finalized, not to move in. Not to claim territory. Just to sit in my old bedroom with the curtains pulled back and the window cracked open, letting the breeze drift in like a forgotten melody. The boxes were gone. The dust had been cleaned. The contractor had finished his job, but it no longer looked like a stranger's project. It looked like a memory, paused, waiting for me to exhale. I sat on the edge of the bed and closed my eyes. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt real. Whole. Unerased. I thought about Greg. About all the years he had stolen credit, twisted narratives, counted on my silence like it was a family heirloom. I thought about the way he looked at me in that meeting, tight-lipped, but cornered. I didn't hate him. Not anymore. I pitied him. Because he'd built his identity on control, on always being the one with the answers, the leverage, the praise, and when that crumbled, he had nothing left. But me? I had something better. I had myself. And I would never lose her again. It's strange how the world keeps spinning after everything breaks. Show the sun still rises, the mail still arrives, the coffee still brews. As if your entire life wasn't just uprooted and scattered in pieces you're still learning how to gather. But it does. And so did I. After the papers were signed and the dust finally settled, there was no dramatic reunion, no emotional family dinner where everyone hugged and cried and promised to do better. There was just quiet. Not the kind of silence that punishes or isolates, but the kind that allows room to breathe, space to think, time to begin again without the weight of what had been hanging from every word. And in that quiet, I slowly began to find myself again, not the version they knew or the one I tried to be, but the one I had buried under all the striving and the shrinking and the waiting to be seen. I went back to work, not just as a designer, but as someone who no longer felt like she was trying to prove her worth with every deliverable or every deadline. I worked from the place inside me that remembered how to love what I do, how to sketch for joy, how to say no without guilt, how to walk into a client pitch with my head held high and my shoulders loose because I knew, now more than ever, that my voice mattered. I reconnected with Avenant that we ever lost touch, but I let her in again, let her see the parts of me that were still healing, still raw, still learning how to be soft after months of armor and fire. We went to dinners, laughed too loud in public, took a weekend trip to Vermont just to see the leaves change. I started therapy again, not out of desperation, but as an act of maintenance, a promise to myself that I wouldn't let old wounds quietly bleed under the surface. And the house. The house became something else entirely. I didn't move in, but I visited sometimes, on quiet weekends, with a book tucked under my arm and a bag of groceries in the passenger seat. I cleaned the kitchen with the radio playing low, watered the plants my mother had long since neglected, lit candles in the windowsills at night the way she used to during storms. It no longer felt like a battlefield, it felt like history, held gently, like a photo album you open when the world feels too sharp. Mom came by once. Unannounced. She knocked like a stranger and stood on the porch with a mason jar of her blueberry jam in one hand and tired eyes that said everything she didn't know how to. "I thought you might like some," she said quietly, holding it out like a peace offering wrapped in fruit and sugar. I took it. Not because I forgave her completely, not because I wanted to pretend none of it happened, but because I understood now that people love in the only ways they know how, and sometimes that love is broken, misplaced, or too fragile to survive unspoken expectations. And sometimes you accept what they offer, not because it's enough, but because you've stopped needing more from people who can't give it. We sat on the porch for a while. Talked about the garden, the weather, her new knee brace. Not a single word about the fight, the lawyers, the documents. But when she left, she turned to me, eyes soft and glossy, and said, "I hope you know we were wrong." It wasn't a full apology, but it was real. And sometimes that's all you can ask for. I watched her car pull away, then went back inside and sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the sunlight fall across the floorboards, golden and forgiving. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. Not because I'd won, but because I'd survived. Because I was home not in walls or titles or deeds, but in myself. And I wasn't going anywhere. If you'd asked me a year ago who I was, I probably would have answered with a title: senior graphic designer, oldest daughter, dependable, quiet, the one who never caused waves. I would have listed roles and accomplishments, things I could measure, things that made sense to other people, things I thought earned me a place in their eyes. But the truth is, none of those things ever protected me from being forgotten. None of those labels made them love me better. And none of them kept the betrayal from sinking in when it came. Now, if you ask me who I am, I'll tell you this: I'm someone who survived being erased by the people she loved most. I'm someone who chose truth over comfort, who stood alone in the middle of grief and still found the strength to say, "I will not disappear for your convenience. I am not furniture in your life, to be moved or discarded when I no longer fits your narrative. I am flesh and blood and history and voice. And I matter." I didn't always believe that. For most of my life, I thought love had to be earned. I thought if I just gave more, forgave faster, smiled bigger, proved harder, I would finally be seen. Finally be chosen. Finally belong. But I've learned that belonging built on silence isn't belonging at all. I've learned that family is not about biology or obligation, it's about showing up. About being heard, about mutual respect and reciprocal care. And when those things are missing, no amount of shared DNA can fill the gap. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from realizing your childhood was shaped around trying to be good enough for people who were never capable of giving you what you needed. It's not a sharp pain, it's a quiet erosion. It eats away at your sense of worth, convincing you to shrink, to smile through the ache, to be low maintenance, because maybe that's the only way to stay close to the people who keep stepping over you. But when you finally stop shrinking, when you finally raise your voice and refuse to disappear, you learn that surviving is its own kind of rebellion. And healing? Healing is the quiet revolution that comes after. To anyone who's ever felt forgotten by their family, anyone who's been written out of their own story, I want you to know you are not alone. Your worth does not depend on their recognition. Your voice matters even if they pretend not to hear it. Your truth is still valid even if no one claps when you say it out loud. You do not need to keep proving yourself to people who have already decided not to see you. You are not hard to love. You are not too much. You are not wrong for wanting to be valued. And if they choose not to, that is their failure, not yours. I don't know what comes next between me and my family. Maybe there will be more conversations. Maybe not. Maybe time will soften what pride won't. Or maybe the space between us is permanent. But either way, I've stopped waiting to be chosen. I've chosen myself. And for the first time in my life, that's more than enough.